Dr. Feversham's Story by Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu and read by Christopher Halton. I have made a point all my life, said the doctor, of believing nothing of the kind. Much ghost talk by firelight had been going on in the library at Fordwick Chase when Dr. Feversham made this remark. As much as to say, observed Amy Fordwick, that you are afraid to tackle the subject because you pique yourself on being strong-minded and are afraid of being convinced against your will. Not precisely, young lady. A man convinced against his will is in a different state of mind from mine in matters like these. But it is true that cases in which the supernatural element appears at first sight to enter are so numerous in my profession that I prefer accepting only the solutions of science so far as they go, to entering on any wild speculations which it would require more time than I should care to devote to them to trace to their origin. But without entering fully into the why and wherefore, how can you be sure that the proper treatment is observed in the numerous cases of mental hallucination which must come under your notice? Inquired Latimer Fordwick, who was studying for the bar. I content myself, my young friend, with following the rules laid down for such cases, and I generally find them successful, answered the old doctor. Then you admit that cases have occurred within your knowledge of which the easiest apparent solution could be one which involved a belief in supernatural agencies? Persisted Latimer, who was rather prolix and pedantic in his talk. I did not say so, said the doctor. But of course he meant us to infer it, said Amy. Now, my dear old doctor, do lay aside professional dignity and give us one good ghost story out of your personal experience. I believe you have been dying to tell one for the last hour, if you would only confess it. I would rather not help to fill that pretty little head with idle fancies, dear child, answered the old man, looking fondly at Amy, who was his especial pet and darling. Nonsense! You know I am even painfully unimaginative and matter-of-fact. And as for idle fancies, is it an idle fancy to think you like to please me? Said Amy coaxingly. Well, after all, you have been frightening each other with so many thrilling tales for the last hour or two that I don't suppose I should do much harm by telling you a circumstance which happened to me when I was a young man, and has always rather puzzled me. A murmur of approval ran round the party. All disposed themselves to listen, and Dr. Feversham, after a prefatory pinch of snuff, began. In my youth I resided for some time with a family in the north of England, in the double capacity of secretary and physician. While I was going through the hospitals of Paris, I became acquainted with my employer, whom I will call Sir James Collingham under rather peculiar circumstances, which have nothing to do with my story. He had an only daughter who was about 16 when I first entered the family, and it was on her account that Sir James wished to have some person with a competent knowledge of medicine and physiology as one of his household. Miss Collingham was subject to fits of a very peculiar kind, which threw her into a sort of trance, lasting from half an hour to 3 or even 4 days, according to the severity of the visitation. During these attacks she occasionally displayed that extraordinary phenomenon which goes by the name of clairvoyance. She saw scenes and persons who were far distant, and described them with wonderful accuracy. Though quite unconscious of all outward things, and apparently in a state of the deepest insensibility, she would address remarks to those present which bore reference to the thoughts then occupying their minds, though they had given them no outward expression. And her remarks showed an insight into matters which had perhaps been carefully kept secret, which might truly be termed preternatural. Under these circumstances, Sir James was very unwilling to bring her into contact with strangers when it could possibly be avoided, and the events which first brought us together, having also led to my treating Miss Collingham rather successfully in a severe attack of her malady, induced her father to offer me a position in his household, which, as a young friendless man, I was very willing to accept. Collingham Westmore was a very ancient house of great extent, and but indifferently kept in repair. The country surrounding it is of great natural beauty, thinly inhabited, and especially at the time I speak of, before railways had penetrated so far north somewhat lonely and inaccessible. A group of small houses clustered around the village church of Westmorton, distant about 3 miles from the mansion of the Collingham family, and a solitary posting house on what was then the Great North Road could be reached by a horseman in about an hour, though the only practicable road for carriages was at least 15 miles from the highway to Collingham Westmore. Wild and lovely in the eyes of an admirer of nature were the hills and cloughs among which I pursued my botanical studies for many a long silent summer day. My occupations at the mansion, everybody called it the mansion, and I must do so from force of habit, though it sounds rather like a house agent's advertisement, were few and light. The society was not particularly to my taste, and the fine old library only attracted me on rainy days, of which, truth to say, we had our full share. The Collingham family circle comprised a maiden aunt of Sir James, Miss Patricia, a stern and awful specimen of the female sex in its fossil state, her ward, Miss Henderson, who, having long passed her pupillage, remained at Collingham Westmore in the capacity of gouvernante and companion to the young heiress, the heiress aforesaid, and myself. A priest, did I say that the Collinghams still professed the old religion, came on Sundays and holy days to celebrate Mass in the gloomy old chapel, but neighbours there were none, and only about half a dozen times during the 4 years I was an inmate of the mansion were strangers introduced into the family party. "How dreadfully dull it must have been!" exclaimed Amy sympathetically. "It was dull," answered the doctor. "Even with my naturally cheerful disposition, and the course of study with which I methodically filled up all my leisure hours, except those devoted to out-of-door exercise, the gloom of the old mansion weighed upon me till I sometimes felt that I must give up my situation at all risks, and return to the world, though it were to struggle with poverty and friendlessness. There was no lack of dismal legends and superstitions connected with the mansion, and every trifling circumstance that occurred was twisted into an omen or presage, whether of good or evil, by the highly wrought fancy of Miss Patricia. These absurdities, together with the past grandeur of their house and the former glories of their religion, formed the staple subjects of conversation when the family was assembled. And as I became more intimately acquainted with the state of my patient, I felt convinced that the atmosphere of gloomy superstition in which she had been reared had fostered, even if it had not altogether been the cause of, her morbid mental and bodily condition. Among the many legends connected with the mansion, one seemed to have a peculiar fascination for Miss Collingham, perhaps because it was the most ghastly and repulsive. One wing of the house was held to be haunted by the spirit of an ancestress of the family, who appeared in the shape of a tall woman, with one hand folded in her white robe and the other pointing upward. It was said that in a room at the end of the haunted wing, this lady had been foully murdered by her jealous husband. The window of the apartment overhung the wild wooded side of one of the cloughs common in the country, and tradition averred that the victim was thrown from this window by her murderer. As she caught hold of the sill in a last frantic struggle for life, he severed her hand at the wrist, and the mutilated body fell with one fearful shriek into the depth below. Since then, a white shadowy form has forever been sitting at the fatal window, or wandering along the deserted passages of the haunted wing with the bleeding stump folded in her robe. And in moments of danger or approaching death to any member of the Collingham family, the same long wild shriek rises slowly from the wooded cliff and peals through the mansion, while to different individuals of the house a pale hand has now and then been visible, laid on themselves or some other of the family, a never-failing omen of danger or death. I need not tell you how false and foolish all this dreary superstition appeared to me, and I exerted all my powers of persuasion to induce Miss Patricia to dwell less on these and similar themes in the presence of Miss Collingham. But there seemed to be something in the very air of the gloomy old mansion which fostered such delusions, for when I spoke to Father O'Connor the priest, and urged on him the pernicious effect which was thus produced on my patient's mind, I found him as fully imbued with the spirit of credulity as the most hysterical housemaid of them all. He solemnly declared to me that he had himself repeatedly seen the pale lady sitting at the fatal window, when on his way to and from his home beyond the hills, and moreover that on the death of Lady Collingham, which occurred at her daughter's birth, he had heard the long shrill death scream echo through the mansion while engaged in the last offices of the church by the bedside of the dying lady. So I found it impossible to fight single-handed against these adverse influences, and could only endeavour to divert the mind of my patient into more healthy channels of thought. In this I succeeded perfectly. She became an enthusiastic botanist, and our rambles in search of the rare and lovely specimens which were to be found among the woods and moors surrounding her dwelling did more for her health, both of body and mind, than all the medical skill I could bring to bear on her melancholy case. 4 years had elapsed since I first took up my abode at Collingham Westmoor. Miss Collingham had grown from a sickly child into a singularly graceful young woman, full of bright intelligence, eager for information, and with scarcely an outward trace remaining of her former fragile health. Still those mysterious swoons occasionally visited her, forming an insurmountable obstacle to her mingling in general society, which she was in all other respects so well fitted to adorn. They occurred without any warning or apparent cause. One moment she would be engaged in animated conversation, and the next, white and rigid as a statue, she would fall back in her chair, insensible to all outward objects, but wrapped and carried away into a world of her own, whose visions she would sometimes describe in glowing language, although she retained no recollection whatever of them when she returned, as suddenly and at as uncertain a period, to her normal condition. On one of these occasions we were sitting after dinner in a large apartment called the summer dining room. Fruit and wine were on the table, and the last red beams of the setting sun lighted up the distant woods, which were in the first flush of their autumn glory. I turned to remark on the beautiful effect of light to Miss Collingham, and at the very moment I did so, she fell back in one of her strange swoons. But instead of the death-like air which her features usually assumed, a lovely smile lighted them up, and an expression of ecstasy made her beauty appear for the moment almost superhuman. Slowly she raised her right hand and pointed in the direction of the setting sun. "He is coming," she said in soft, clear tones. "Life and light are coming with him, life and light and liberty." Her hand fell gently by her side, the rapt expression faded from her countenance, and the usual death-like blank overspread it. This trance passed away like others, and by midnight the house was profoundly still. Soon after that hour, a vociferous peal at the great hall bell roused most of the inmates from sleep. My rooms were in a distant quarter of the house, and a door opposite to that of my bedroom led to the haunted wing, but was always kept locked. I started up on hearing a second ring, and looked out in hopes of seeing a servant pass, and ascertaining the cause of this unusual disturbance. I saw no one, and after listening for a while to the opening of the hall door and the sound of distant voices, I made up my mind that I should be sent for if wanted, and re-entered my room. As I was closing the door, I was rather startled to see a tall object of greyish-white colour and indistinct form issue from the gallery, whose door, as I said before, had always been locked in my recollection. For a moment I felt as though rooted to the spot, and a strange sensation crept over me. The next, all trace of the appearance had vanished, and I persuaded myself that what I had seen must have been some effect of light from the open door of my room. The cause of the nightly disturbance appeared at breakfast on the following morning in the shape of a remarkably handsome young man, who was introduced by Sir James as his nephew, Don Luis de Cabral, the son of an only sister long dead, who had married a Spaniard of high rank. Don Luis showed but little trace of his southern parentage, if I may so express it. All the depth and warmth of colouring in that portion of his blood, which he inherited from his Spanish ancestors, came out in the raven-black hair and large, lustrous dark eyes, which impressed you at once with their uncommon beauty. For the rest, he was a fine, well-grown young man, no darker in complexion than an Englishman might well be, and with a careless, happy boyishness of manner, which won immediately on the regard of strangers, and rendered his presence in the house like that of a perpetual sunbeam. We all wondered, after a little while, what we had done before Louise came among us. He was as a son to Sir James. Miss Patricia softened to this new and pleasing interest in her colourless existence, as I could not have believed it was in her fossilised nature to do. Miss Henderson became animated, almost young, under the reviving influence of the youth and joyousness of our new inmate, and I own that I speedily attached myself with a warm and affectionate regard to the happy, unselfish nature that seemed to brighten all who came near it. But the most remarkable effect of the presence of Don Luis de Cabral among us was visible in Miss Collingham. Love at first sight, often considered as a mere phrase, was in the case of these two young creatures an unmistakable reality. From the moment of their first meeting, the cousins were mutually drawn toward each other, and seeing the bright and wonderful change wrought by the presence of Don Luis in Blanche Collingham, I could not but remember, with the interest that attaches to a curious psychological phenomenon, the words she uttered in her trance on the eve of his arrival. Life, light and liberty indeed appeared given to all that was best and brightest in her nature. Her health improved visibly, and her beauty, always touching, became radiant in its full development. My duties towards her were now merely nominal, and when, about 2 months later, Sir James announced to me her approaching marriage, and confessed that it was with this object he had invited Don Luis to come and make the acquaintance of his English relations, the strong opinions I entertained against the marriage of first cousins, and also on the especial inadvisability of any project of marriage in the case of Miss Collingham, could not prevent my hearty rejoicing in the fair prospect of happiness in which two persons who deeply interested me were indulging. Winter set in early and severely that year among our northern hills, and with a view to Blanche's removal from its withering influence, which I always considered prejudicial to her, the preparations for the marriage were hurried on, and the ceremony was fixed to take place about the middle of December. The travelling carriage, which was to convey the young couple on their way southward, was to arrive at the nearest railway station, then more than 30 miles distant, a week before the marriage, and as some important portions of the trousseau, together with a valuable package of jewels intended by Don Luis as presents for his bride, were expected at the same time. The young man announced his intention of riding across the hills in order to superintend the conveyance of the carriage and its contents along the rough mountain roads that it must traverse. We were all sitting around the great fireplace in the winter parlour on the evening before his departure. Miss Collingham had been languid and depressed throughout the day, and often adverted to the long wintry ride he was to undertake in a strain of apprehension, at which Don Luis laughed gaily. To divert her mind, he recounted various adventures which had befallen him in foreign lands, with a vigorous simplicity of description which enchained her attention and interested us all. Suddenly, so sitting, Miss Collingham leaned forward and in a changed, eager voice exclaimed, "Louis, take away your hand from your throat." We looked. Louis's hands were lying one over the other on his knee in a careless attitude that was habitual to him. "Take it away, I say. Oh, take it away." Miss Collingham started to her feet as she uttered these words almost in a shriek, and then fell back rigid and senseless, her outstretched hand still pointing to her betrothed. The fit was a severe one, but by morning it had yielded to remedies, and Louis set off early on his ride to make the most of the short daylight, and intending to return with the carriage on the morrow. All that day Miss Collingham remained in a half-conscious state. It was a dreary day of gloom, with a piercing north wind, and toward evening the snow began to fall in those close, compact flakes which forebode a heavy storm. We were glad to think that Louis must have reached his destination before it began, but when the next morning dawned on a wide expanse of snow, and the air was still thick with fast-falling flakes, it was feared that the state of the roads would preclude all hope of the arrival of the carriage on that day. My patient took no heed of the untoward state of the weather. She was still in a drowsy condition, very unlike that which usually succeeded her attacks, and Miss Henderson, who had watched by her through the night, told me she spoke more than once in a strange, excited manner, as though carrying on a conversation with someone whom she appeared to see by her bedside. As the good lady, however, could give but a very imperfect and incoherent account of what had passed, I was left in some doubt as to whether Miss Collingham had seen more or Miss Henderson less than there really was to be seen, as I had before had reason to believe that she was not a very vigilant nurse. So the hours went on, and night closed in. Sir James began to feel some uneasiness at the non-appearance, not only of Don Luis, but also of the priest who was to have arrived at Collingham Westmore on that day. On questioning some of the servants who had been out of the house, the absence of Father O'Connor at least was satisfactorily accounted for. They all declared that it would be quite impossible for those best acquainted with the hills to find their way across them in the blinding drifts which had never ceased throughout the day. We concluded that Father O'Connor and Don Luis were alike storm-stayed, and had no remedy but patience. Late in the evening, it must have been near midnight, I was in Miss Collingham's dressing room with Miss Patricia, who intended to watch by her through the night. We were talking by the fire of the snowstorm which still continued, and of the hindrance it might prove to the marriage, the day fixed for which was now less than a week distant, when we heard a voice in the adjoining room, where we imagined the object of our care to be sleeping. We went in. Miss Collingham was sitting up in bed, her eyes wide open, in one of her rigid fits. She was speaking rapidly in a low tone, unlike her usual voice. "You cannot get through all that snow," she said. "Get help. There are men not far off with spades. Oh, be careful. You are off the road. Stop, stop. That is the way to Armstrong's Clough. Does not the postboy know the road? He is bewildered. I tell you it is madness to go on. See, one of the horses has fallen. He kicks. He will hit you. Oh, how dark it is. And the snow covers your lantern, and you cannot see the edge. Now the horse is up again, but he cannot go on. Do not beat him, Luis. It is not his fault, poor beast. The snow is too thick, and you are on rough ground. Now he rears, he backs, the other one backs also. The wheel of the carriage is over the edge. Ah!" The scream with which these wild, hurried words ended seemed to be taken up and echoed from a distance. Miss Patricia stared at me with a ghastly white face of horror, and I felt my blood curdle as that long, shrill, unearthly shriek pealed through the silent passages. It grew louder and nearer, and seemed to sweep through the room, dying away in the opposite direction. Miss Patricia fell forward without a word in a dead faint. I looked at Miss Collingham. She had not moved or shown any sign of hearing or heeding that awful sound. In a few seconds the room was filled with terrified women, roused from their sleep by the weird cry which rang through the house. Miss Patricia was conveyed by some of them to her own room, where, after much difficulty, we restored her to consciousness. Her first act was to grasp me by the arm. "Mr. Feversham, for the love of the Holy Virgin, do not leave me. I have seen that which I cannot look upon and live." I soothed her as best I might, and at last persuaded her to allow me to leave her with her own maid in order to visit my other patient, promising to return shortly. I found no change whatever in Miss Collingham. Sir James was in the room trying to establish some degree of calmness and order among the terrified women. We succeeded in persuading most of them to take a restorative and return to bed, and leaving two of the most self-possessed to watch beside Miss Collingham, who was still completely insensible, we went together to Miss Patricia's room. "Brother, I have seen her," she exclaimed on Sir James's entrance. "Seen who, my dear Patricia?" "The pale lady, the spectre of our house," she replied, shuddering from head to foot. She passed through the room, her hand upraised, and the blood spots on her garment. "Oh, James, my time is come, and Father O'Connor is not here." Sir James did not attempt to combat his sister's superstitious terrors, but appeared, on the contrary, almost as deeply impressed as herself, and questioned her closely about the apparition. Her answers led to some mention of the strange vision which Miss Collingham was describing in a trance just before the scream was heard. At Sir James's request, I put down in writing, as nearly as I could remember, all she had said, and so great was the impression it made on my mind that I believe I recalled her very words. Knowing all we did of her abnormal condition while in a state of trance, it was impossible not to fear that she might have been describing a scene that was actually occurring at the time, and Sir James determined to send out a party as soon as daylight came on the road by which Don Luis must arrive. The morning dawned brightly with a keen frost, and several men were sent off along the road to blank with the first rays of light. Some hours afterward, Father O'Connor arrived, having made his way with considerable difficulty across the hill. Miss Patricia claimed his first attention, for my unhappy charge remained senseless and motionless as ever. After a long conference, he came to me with grave looks. "She is at the window this day," he said, shaking his head sorrowfully, when I had told him my share of the last night's singular experiences. "The pale lady is there. I saw her as I came by the bridge as plainly as now I see you. We shall have evil tidings of that poor lad before nightfall, or I am strangely mistaken." Evil tidings indeed they were that reached us on the return of some of the exploring party. They were first attracted from following as nearly as they could the line of road, blocked as it was with drifts of snow, by hearing the howling of a dog at some little distance in the direction of the precipitous ravine which went by the name of Armstrong's Clough. Following the sound, they came upon traces of wheels in the hillside, where no carriage could have gone had it not been for the deep snow which concealed and smoothed away the inequalities of the ground. These marks were traced here and there till they led to the verge of the precipice, where a struggle had evidently taken place, and masses of snow had been dislodged and fallen into the ravine. Looking below, the only thing they could see in the waste of snow was a little dog, who was known to be in the habit of running with the post-horses from blank, which was scraping wildly in the snow and filling the air with its dismal howlings. A considerable circuit had to be made before the bottom of the clough could be reached, and then the whole tragedy was revealed. There lay the broken carriage, the dead horses, and 2 stiffened corpses under the snow that had drifted over and around them. "I need not pursue the melancholy story. I was an old fool for telling it to you," said the doctor. "But Miss Collingham, what became of her?" asked an eager listener. "Well, she did not recover," answered the doctor with a slight trembling in his voice. "It was a sad matter altogether, and within a short time she lay beside her betrothed in the family vault below the chapel. Sir James broke up his establishment and went abroad, and I never saw any of the family again." "And what did you do, doctor?" "I went to London to seek my fortune as best I might, and I hope you may all prosper as well, my young friends." "And is it all really true?" asked Amy, who had listened with breathless attention. "That is the worst of it, it really is," said the doctor. The end.